Hello, and welcome to Artificial Fluency. I'm your host, John, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Emma. Today, we're going meta. We're talking about how to learn English effectively through podcasts, including ones like ours.
That's right, John. Podcasts have become an incredibly powerful tool for language learners, and for good reason. They offer authentic language, diverse topics, and the flexibility to learn anywhere, anytime. Today, we'll guide our listeners through how to make the most of podcasts in their English learning journey.
Perfect. I think a lot of our listeners are already using podcasts to improve their English, but they might not be taking full advantage of all the benefits podcasts can offer. So let's start with the basics. Why are podcasts particularly effective for language learning?
There are several key advantages. First, podcasts expose you to natural, conversational English. Unlike many textbooks or language apps that use simplified language, podcasts feature real people speaking at a natural pace, with authentic expressions and intonation.
That's so important. I remember when I was learning Spanish. I could understand my textbook perfectly, but then I'd watch a Spanish movie and be completely lost, because the way people actually speak is quite different from textbook. Examples?
Exactly. Another major benefit is the massive variety of content available. Whatever your interests, whether it's science, history, sports, cooking, technology, or business, there are podcasts covering those topics in English. This means you can find content you're genuinely interested in, which makes learning much more engaging.
And that engagement is crucial for retention, isn't it? When you're learning through topics you genuinely care about, you're more likely to stay motivated and remember the language.
Absolutely. Podcasts also offer incredible convenience. You can listen while commuting, exercising, cooking, or doing household chores. This helps you integrate language learning into your daily routine without setting aside extra time.
Let's talk about different types of podcasts for English learners. I think we can break them down into a few main categories.
Good idea. I'd say the first category is podcasts specifically designed for English learners, like All Ears English, ESL Pod, or English Learning for Curious Minds. These typically speak at a slower pace, explain vocabulary, and often focus on teaching specific language points.
Those are great for beginners and intermediate learners who might struggle with content designed for native speakers. Then there are podcasts like ours, which aren't exclusively about teaching English, but are conscious of having language learners in the audience, so we try to speak clearly and occasionally explain more complex terms.
Right? And then there are mainstream podcasts created for native English speakers. These include news podcasts like NPR's Up First, storytelling podcasts like This American Life, or specialized interest podcasts about science, history, sports, or any other topic you can imagine.
These offer the most authentic language experience, but can be challenging for learners. Let's talk about how to choose the right podcasts based on your proficiency level.
For beginners, I'd recommend starting with podcasts specifically designed for English learners. Look for those that mention slow, clear, or for beginners in their descriptions. These will often repeat key phrases, speak at a reduced pace, and explain vocabulary.
Intermediate learners might be ready for podcasts like ours or news summary podcasts, which tend to use straightforward language, but at a more natural pace. The BBC's 6-Minute English is a great example. It's short, focused, and designed to be accessible while still being authentic.
And for advanced learners, the world is really your oyster. You can choose podcasts based entirely on your interests rather than language level, though you might start with clearer speakers before moving to podcasts with multiple speakers, strong accents, or lots of slang.
What about strategies for getting the maximum benefit from podcast listening? Because just playing a podcast in the background isn't necessarily going to improve your English dramatically.
That's an important point. Active listening is key. One effective strategy is to listen to the same episode multiple times. The first time, focus on understanding the general meaning. The second time, try to catch more details. By the third listen, you might pick up on subtle expressions, transitions, and natural speech patterns.
I like that approach. Another strategy is shadowing, where you listen to a short segment, pause, and then repeat what you heard, trying to match the pronunciation, intonation, and rhythm of the speaker. This is great for improving your speaking skills.
Shadowing is incredibly effective. Another technique is to take notes while listening. Write down new words or phrases that catch your attention, along with their context. Later, you can look them up and create flashcards or a personal vocabulary list.
And many podcasts offer transcripts, which can be a game changer for language learners. You can read along while listening or review the transcript afterward to clarify anything you didn't catch.
Absolutely. Transcripts allow you to connect the sounds you hear with the written words, which is especially helpful for terms you might not recognize by ear alone. They're also great for review.
Let's talk about how to integrate podcast learning into a broader language study routine. Because while podcasts are powerful, they work best as part of a comprehensive approach.
That's right. Podcasts primarily develop your listening skills, but language learning involves multiple competencies: speaking, reading, writing, vocabulary, and grammar. A balanced approach would combine podcast listening with other activities.
For instance, you might use what you learn from podcasts as material for speaking practice. If you have a language exchange partner or tutor, you could discuss the content of a podcast you both listen to.
Great suggestion. You could also keep a journal where you summarize podcast episodes in your own words. This helps reinforce what you've learned and practices your writing skills.
I've also heard of learners who record themselves discussing their thoughts about a podcast episode, then listen back to identify areas for improvement in their own speaking. It's like creating your own mini podcast response.
I love that idea. Another approach is to use podcasts as a springboard for vocabulary building. When you encounter new words, don't just learn them in isolation. Look for similar terms, opposites, and different forms of the word to build a richer vocabulary network.
Let's address some common challenges listeners might face when using podcasts for language learning and how to overcome them.
One common challenge is understanding different accents. English is spoken around the world with incredible variety, from British and American to Australian, Indian, Nigerian, and many more accents.
That diversity is what makes English so rich, but it can be challenging for learners. My advice is to start with accents you find clearer and gradually expose yourself to different varieties. Many learners begin with standard American or British accents before branching out.
Another challenge is keeping up with the speed of natural conversation. If that's an issue, many podcast apps allow you to adjust the playback speed. You might start at 0.8x speed, then gradually increase to normal speed as your comprehension improves.
And what about staying motivated with regular listening? It can be hard to maintain a consistent practice.
Creating a routine definitely helps. Maybe you always listen to an English podcast during your morning commute or while exercising. Making it part of your daily schedule increases consistency.
Finding podcasts that truly interest you is also crucial for motivation. If you're forcing yourself to listen to content you find boring just because it's in English, you're less likely to stick with it.
Exactly. And joining online communities or study groups focused on English learning through podcasts can provide accountability and motivation. You can discuss episodes, share new vocabulary, and encourage each other.
Let's share some specific podcast recommendations for our listeners at different proficiency levels.
For beginners, I'd recommend Slow English, English Learning for Curious Minds, or Simple English podcasts. These are designed specifically for language learners with clear speech and helpful explanations.
For intermediate learners, podcasts like The English We Speak from BBC Luke's English podcast, or news summary podcasts like NPR's Up First or BBC Minute provide more natural speech, but with relatively straightforward content.
And for advanced learners, I'd suggest diving into mainstream podcasts that match your interests. Podcasts like Radiolab for science, The Daily for news, or This American Life for storytelling are excellent choices. They use rich, authentic language and complex narrative structures.
Don't forget genre-specific podcasts too. Cooking podcasts are great for learning food vocabulary, business podcasts for professional terminology, and so on. Choose based on your learning goals. As we start to wrap up, let's talk about how to track progress when learning English through podcasts, because that can sometimes be challenging.
Great point. Unlike formal courses with tests and grades, podcast learning is more self-directed. One approach is to periodically record yourself, summarizing or discussing a podcast episode, then compare recordings over time to notice improvements in your fluency, pronunciation, and vocabulary.
I like that idea. Another method is to occasionally challenge yourself with a podcast slightly above your comfort level. If you find you understand more of it than you would have a few months ago, that's clear progress.
Keeping a vocabulary journal from your podcast listening can also show growth. When you review it after several months, you might be surprised by how many words and phrases have become part of your active vocabulary.
And don't underestimate the value of those moments when you realize you've understood humor, cultural references, or subtle points in a podcast. Those are significant milestones in language comprehension.
Absolutely. Understanding humor in another language is a particularly powerful indicator of progress.
Before we close, let's summarize the key takeaways for our listeners who want to maximize their English learning through podcasts.
First, choose podcasts that match both your proficiency level and your interests. As you advance, gradually challenge yourself with more complex content.
Second, practice active listening strategies rather than passive background listening. Techniques like repeated listening, shadowing, note-taking, and using transcripts all enhance learning.
Third, integrate podcast learning with other language activities like speaking practice, writing summaries, or vocabulary building to develop well-rounded English skills.
Fourth, be consistent but flexible. Create a regular listening routine, but don't be afraid to switch podcasts if one isn't working for you. The most effective podcast is one you actually enjoy and will continue listening to.
And finally, be patient with yourself. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. Celebrate small victories, like understanding a joke or learning a new expression along the way.
That's great advice. And I'd add one more thing. Don't be afraid to reach out to podcast creators. Many of us, especially those who know we have language learners in our audience, are happy to answer questions or clarify points from our episodes.
Absolutely. Language learning is a community experience, and most content creators appreciate engaged listeners.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's meta episode about learning English through podcasts. We hope you found these strategies helpful for your language journey.
And remember, every minute you spend listening to English podcasts is valuable practice. Even this very episode is helping you improve your comprehension skills right now.
That's right. Thank you for listening to Artificial Fluency. If you have questions about English learning strategies or suggestions for future topics, please reach out to us. Until next time.
Happy listening and learning.